Welcome back. We're talking about the current situation in the world's youngest country, South Sudan. We just spoke to the South Sudanese ambassador to the United States about peace efforts in the country. Now we're joined by Hilde Johnson from Oslo. Hilde is the former head of the United Nations mission in the Republic of South Sudan and author of the new book, South Sudan, The Untold Story from Independence to Civil War. And with us in the studio, Brian Adeba is the Associate Director of Policy for the Enough Project, a non-profit focusing on human rights. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Hilde, as I mentioned, you were head of the UN mission in South Sudan, and as we've been reporting, fighting has resumed, the peace talks have collapsed. This looks like it's becoming a bit of an intractable problem. What do you think is needed to undo this logjam?
It's absolutely critical that the peace agreement is rescued and revitalized. There's no other way than to take three critical steps. One is to bring all the signatories to the peace agreement into the process. That has to happen very quickly. Sidelining them will only create new spoilers and more fighting. Secondly, there needs to be a roundtable of all the different political forces of South Sudan to do a third thing, which is establish a caretaker government, which can now bring the country out of the mess. It's absolutely fundamental it happens very quickly, and we think the region has an important role to play in making this happen. Without it, I'm really very worried that South Sudan not only will be at risk of imploding, but that it may be irreversible. So South Sudan needs to be saved, not only from fighting, also from failing and from falling apart.
Right, Hilde, bringing all these sides together, as you've mentioned there, who does that? Is that the responsibility of the United Nations to push them, bring them together?
The peace agreement that was negotiated was done by IGAD as the facilitator and the mediator. IGAD is the regional organization of the Horn of Africa. They were in charge of this. It is natural that the neighboring countries take more responsibility for this. The UN has been in a supportive role. That should do it at this point in time. I don't think I should go in and advise particularly on that. The main point is a roundtable should be convened, and it's not wise to exclude signatories to the peace agreement, because we will find ourselves in a situation where they will become major spoilers. Already, the fighting has resumed, as you were alerting to in your report. Hence, this rescue operation is very urgent.
Brian, what is the political situation in South Sudan right now?
Well, the situation has deteriorated considerably. We have seen that ethnically targeted killings are predominating in the southernmost part of the country. Just over the weekend, a convoy of 4 trucks was stopped on the Yei-Juba road, and masked men came out of the bush and asked the passengers to get off the trucks, and then singled out people from the Dinka ethnicity and killed them. 21 people have been killed so far, and this will elicit a retaliation, and it creates the possibility of such incidents breaking out across the country, and it could throw the country into a situation where Rwanda is possible.
And what are the leaders, the political leaders of these two groups? What are they saying?
Everyone is denying that the situation is what it is right now. For the government itself has not even considered that there is an insurgency that it's battling in the Equatorials where this incident happened. The SPLM-IO, on the other hand, denies that its soldiers were behind the killings that happened over the weekend. And the situation is very tense at the moment, and the measures that Hilde outlined are needed at the moment. But also, it is very important that the international community takes measures that will force the leaders to change their opinions about sticking to the war ideal. And we suggest that targeted sanctions and anti-money laundering measures that will cripple their capacity to move assets, because this war is all about really money, the ability to move money to borders across South Sudan, borders the neighboring South Sudan. This has to be incapacitated so that they're shut off from the financial business global system. and to send the message that war is not a profitable business.
Okay, I want to get back to those targeted sanctions in a moment, but let's go back to Hilde in Oslo. And Hilde, your book is called South Sudan, The Untold Story. What is the untold story?
That's the story of why this has happened. Basically, that the liberators who fought for decades for freedom and independence, for justice, actually have ended up in war against each other, committing terrible atrocities against their own people, and actually are now on the verge of destroying the very country they fought for. This is a huge paradox, and it's not easy to understand for any of us. How could this happen? My book lays out a number of the reasons why. This is linked both to the political power struggle within the leadership that had long historic roots, but it also is related to the lack of institutions. The country was basically without a state, and not much reforms happened in the security sector and other sectors that could be buffers when this political crisis escalated. And I think thirdly, the corruption issues have contributed also to this internal implosion in the country, make it very weak at the face of these huge challenges of a very significant political crisis. But the most important thing, these leaders actually were major risk takers. They helped blow up the situation through their own actions and unfortunately perpetuated the conflict against each other. That's the main reason. But these others are also important. And I think we all should learn lessons from what has happened and also avoid this now from repeating itself. And I do agree with Brian Adeba's point. This is now quickly escalating with ethnic violence taking over. It's very, very important to stop it as quickly as possible.
So, Brian, we have this escalation of violence. What is the humanitarian situation in the country now?
Well, the humanitarian situation is in a very dire situation. Right now, there's hunger going on, famine in the northern parts of the country, displacement of thousands locally and externally, lack of food, and the government does not have the capacity to help the displaced people and to arrest the humanitarian crisis that's evolving at the moment. Aid agencies are doing all that they can, but at the moment, the work of the aid agencies is being obstructed by elements in the government. For instance, free movement is not being allowed for aid workers. Secondly, the targeting of aid workers on roads and in the towns, and the looting of aid agencies by armed people affiliated to the government.
Where is most of the fighting taking place right now?
Well, the Equatorias, the southernmost part of the country right now, is the new theater of operations that's just evolved over recently. Previously, this war was mainly restricted to the northeastern parts of the country, but what we're seeing is that the Equatorias, there are 3 states in the southernmost part of the country, and all of them are engulfed in fighting at the moment. There is continuous fighting in the northern east part of the country, where initially this also started, as well as in the northern part or northwestern part of the country in western Bahar Ghazal and also in Awil in the northern states. So the situation is at the moment where localized conflicts are sprouting all over the country.
Right. Hilde, the current Vice President of South Sudan recently addressed the UN General Assembly in New York. Let's watch.
Our intervention in such countries, taken supposedly to protect civilians, advance democracy, respect human rights and justice, have not always produced the expected results. Instead, in most cases, and we end up creating displacement and refugees. The attitude of superiority and patronage, disguised as promoting democracy, human rights, freedom and justice, can easily lead to serious crisis in form of resistance by the affected parties.
So he's very critical there. What do you make of what he said?
Well, to me, who's been working on Sudan and South Sudan for very many years, it sounded very much like the Khartoum government to me, criticizing the international community, criticizing them for wanting to come in to protect civilians, and basing that on national sovereignty. I have to say it's very sad that it has come to this, that this is the language used by South Sudan, who without the support of the international community would not have survived these years of liberation struggle, nor would they have been in the situation they are. They had the comprehensive peace agreement, which led to the possibility of a referendum. Without the United Nations, they would never have been able to conduct the referendum and get independence. And this is not the language we would like to hear from the liberators and from the SPLM leaders. I hope they change their minds, because they are really, really, really in need of the international community, desperately in need. South Sudan, at this point in time, is the second largest humanitarian catastrophe after Syria. Without support of the international community, there is no chance that they will be able to get the country on the right foot, if indeed we manage to see a peace agreement be achieved that has all parties around it, plus a clear roadmap towards a caretaker government. I have to say, this is not what we would like to hear from South Sudan, and I hope they will change their rhetoric and also understand that if they are going to have a country that will survive this turmoil without support, it is not going to be achieved.
Brian, if we look at some of the other measures being considered by the international community, let's say more coercive measures, you talked earlier on about sanctions, targeted sanctions. There's also a talk about an arms embargo. Is that being heard? How is that being received in Juba?
Well, the government, as expected, is not very keen on having sanctions. That's the storyline that they have adopted. They say that the sanctions will be detrimental to the country. We're saying that the sanctions need not affect the whole country. The sanctions need to be targeted at specific leaders, the political elite who are behind the perpetuation of this war. If done this way, this would include travel bans on their persons and their families and the networks that support them. Then it would serve the incentive of changing their thinking on perpetuating war. An arms embargo, the government also says that it will be detrimental. And we believe that an arms embargo at this time will go a long way in dissuading both parties from pursuing war.
Okay, Hilde, very quickly, what about the possibility of sending in more peacekeeping troops?
So this is a measure that the Security Council decided to do after the crisis in July, which ended up in major fighting and many people killed. They decided to increase the force in Juba with another 4,000 soldiers from the region, a so-called regional protection force with a stronger mandate and a very specific mandate to stabilize the capital. This is still very important, but it is first and foremost a critical measure in support of a political strategy which can bring the country out of this mess. So in support of this strategy, such forces will have a very critical role to play. And the Security Council has taken the decision. Unfortunately, it seems to be rather slow in terms of its implementation. But the most urgent measure to be taken now is the political one, to bring the parties together and to have all signatories at the table and a round table that can bring about a caretaker government. I don't think with this only as a measure, the force, we will be able to see stability in South Sudan. So I think we need to have the combination of the two, with the political path being taken first, the forces coming in support of that.